Welcome to Terrormouth, where the night doesn't just hold secrets, it remembers them. Story 1. The Stranger at Willow Creek. Willow Creek was small, so small that everyone knew everyone else, and outsiders were immediately noticed. Tucked between rolling hills and dense pine forests, it was picturesque but isolated. A town where unusual events were whispered about but rarely acknowledged. The Reed family had lived there for generations. David and Clara Reed, along with their teenage daughter Lily, ran a local bookstore that doubled as a cafe. Life was predictable, quiet, and safe until the stranger arrived. It was a foggy Friday morning when he first appeared. The man had no name, at least none he would give. He walked into the cafe with a long, dark coat, water dripping from its shoulders despite the lack of rain. His face was pale, his eyes a dull grey that seemed to pierce through the soul. He ordered coffee black, no sugar, no cream, and sat silently, staring out the window at the fog-draped streets. Lily, curious and a bit unnerved, approached him. "Are you visiting Willow Creek?" she asked. He didn't answer. He only tilted his head slightly, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the cafe, as if observing something invisible. By the end of the day, townsfolk had noticed him too. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't seem to need food or water, and he always appeared in places just beyond normal sight. Some claimed to see him standing in the woods outside town, staring toward homes as if he knew their secrets. Others said he vanished when approached. That night, the Reeds noticed strange occurrences in their home. Doors that had been locked were found open. Lights flickered with no electrical cause. Lily's cat hissed at empty corners, arching its back and fleeing. The next day, the stranger returned. This time, he stood outside the bookstore, watching silently as the town moved. People tried to interact, but he simply faded into the morning mist, always appearing just at the periphery of vision. Then the letters began, handwritten, unsigned, delivered to the Reed residence, a single word on each page. Words that seemed harmless at first, waiting, soon but arranged over days. They spelled something that chilled the Reeds to their core. Your time will be counted. Panic gripped the town. Willow Creek had never seen anything like this. The stranger seemed omnipresent. Someone reported seeing him reflected in mirrors in their homes. Always behind them, always still, always silent. Clara attempted to rationalize it. "It's a prank," she said. "Someone trying to scare us." But the feeling of being constantly observed gnawed at her. Even David, practical and logical, felt an unease that settled in his chest, growing heavier each day. Then came the night the fog rolled in, thicker than ever. Lily was alone in her room, reading by the window when she saw him standing in the middle of the street. His coat flapped in a wind she couldn't feel, and his grey eyes reflected the streetlights, though the lights were off. Suddenly, the world seemed wrong. Time slowed. Shadows stretched unnaturally, merging with the fog. The stranger raised a hand, not to wave, but as if counting something invisible. Numbers echoed in Lily's mind, 1, 2, 3, and the air grew cold enough to make her lungs ache. When she screamed, the sound seemed to vanish into the fog. The stranger was gone the instant the Reeds ran to her room, but the impression remained. The house, the town, even the air itself had been measured. By morning, the townsfolk whispered of an ancient legend. Willow Creek had always been careful with outsiders. For centuries, strange visitors had arrived, and those who lingered too long disappeared, never leaving a trace. Some believed the town itself counted newcomers, marking them, measuring them, before claiming them. The reeds were terrified but unbroken. They were determined to understand the stranger. Lily began documenting everything: his appearances, the letters, the strange phenomena, and the eerie coincidences that followed each sighting. The stranger didn't speak, didn't interact, yet his presence altered everything: the way the fog rolled, the way shadows clung to corners, the whispers of unseen voices at night. It was as though the town itself were watching through him. The Reeds realized one grim truth: the stranger wasn't visiting Willow Creek by accident. He was a precursor, a harbinger of something far older and far darker than the town could comprehend, and the Reeds had unknowingly drawn his attention. The fog that night was heavier than anything Willow Creek had ever seen, curling through streets, alleys, and trees like living smoke. The Reeds huddled inside their home, hearts pounding, every shadow stretching unnaturally. Lily's notebook lay open on the table, pages filled with sketches of the stranger, the letters and the strange numbers she had begun to notice repeating: 1, 2, 3. David tried to comfort his family. It's just some person, playing tricks, but he didn't believe it himself. The air felt alive, heavy. Watching, then the stranger appeared. Not outside this time. He was inside the house, standing in the doorway of the living room. His coat hung like shadows that had weight, and his grey eyes, dull yet piercing, scanned each of them as if measuring, counting. Clara froze. How did you get in here? He didn't answer. He raised a hand slowly, deliberately, and the numbers echoed, not in speech, but in the air itself, vibrating through their bones. 4, 4, 4. Complete, complete, complete. The room darkened. Shadows thickened in the corners, coiling, writhing, as if alive. The furniture warped, stretching slightly as the stranger moved closer. Time slowed, each second dragging like molten tar. The Reeds realized the truth. The stranger wasn't human. He was a harbinger, a collector and agent of something older than the town itself. Lily remembered the letters. Words like watching, waiting, soon, and the repeated threat: your time will be counted. The stranger hadn't been visiting Willow Creek by accident. He had been marking the Reeds, preparing the way for what was to come. Desperate, David grabbed a heavy candlestick. "Stay behind me," he shouted. He swung at the figure, but his hands passed through nothing but a shadow, thick as smoke. Clara screamed as the stranger extended an impossibly long arm. Reaching toward Lily, she felt herself being pulled not physically, but mentally toward him. A cold numbness gripped her, and images flashed in her mind. The countless families he had claimed, their eyes wide in silent terror, faces twisted in endless echoes. The Reeds knew there was no strength in fighting. There was only submission or outsmarting him. Lily noticed the numbers again scribbled across her notebook, repeated in the air, even in the flickering candlelight. 1, 2, 3, 4. She remembered an old town legend her grandmother had whispered about strange visitors could be repelled by acknowledgement of the count, by completing the measure themselves and offering it back. Lily spoke, her voice trembling but steady. "We accept the count. 4 of us, complete. But we are not yours. We give ourselves willingly, but not to you. Not now." The stranger paused. The shadows froze. The numbers vibrated louder, echoing through the room, then slowed, one by one, until silence fell. The grey eyes flickered curiosity, not malice. For the first time, and then the stranger dissipated, melting into the fog at the edges of the room. The air cleared. The furniture returned to normal. The room no longer pulsed with unnatural energy. The reeds collapsed, exhausted, trembling. They had survived, but barely. By morning, the fog had lifted. Willow Creek seemed ordinary again, though the townsfolk whispered that the stranger had visited the reeds specifically. The family decided to leave town, abandoning the bookstore and the home that had been their life. Yet, even miles away, strange occurrences followed them. Reflections in mirrors sometimes flickered with grey eyes. Faint whispers counted in their minds during silent nights. And Lily's notebook. Pages would sometimes shift on their own, rearranging the numbers, as if reminding them the visitor had not forgotten. The stranger had passed, but the measure of Willow Creek and of the reeds remained. And somewhere, in the fog-covered town, another family would soon learn that outsiders are never welcome and that the count is always exacting, always patient, always waiting. Story 2. The Midnight Guest. Maple Hollow was the kind of small town that prided itself on familiarity. Everyone knew everyone, and outsiders were rare, often regarded with suspicion. That made the arrival of the stranger all the more unsettling. It was late autumn when the Millers moved into their new home at the edge of town. Thomas and Rachel Miller, along with their son, Noah, were seeking peace away from the city. The house was old, a colonial-style structure with peeling paint and a long driveway lined with towering oaks. Locals whispered that the home had been empty for decades, though no one could explain why. The first strange occurrence happened on their very first night. Rachel was putting Noah to bed when she noticed a figure standing at the end of the hallway. Pale, tall, with a long black coat and an expressionless face. The figure seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves. "Thomas?" she called, but the hallway remained empty. Noah, wide-eyed, whispered, "Mum, it's looking at me." Before she could respond, the figure vanished, leaving only the faintest echo of a footstep, though the hardwood floors were untouched. Over the next few days, the stranger appeared at odd hours, sometimes at the edge of the driveway, standing completely still under the street lamp, sometimes glimpsed through fogged windows, silently watching. He never spoke, never moved in a way that seemed natural. Then the knocking began, always at midnight. At first it was soft, almost polite, at the front door. But as the nights went on, it grew louder, more insistent. No one was ever there when the Millers checked. Rachel tried to rationalize it. Drafts, squirrels, maybe a prank by kids in town. Thomas was skeptical but uneasy. Noah, however, began drawing pictures of the visitor, each one more detailed than the last. A tall, featureless figure, eyes hollow, coat flapping in wind that no one else could feel. One night, as the clock struck 12, the knocking crescendoed into pounding. The front door rattled violently, though no wind stirred. Then a voice, low, hollow, not quite human, whispered from the shadows, "I am here for the reckoning." The Millers froze. The air grew thick and cold, their breaths visible even inside the house. Shadows stretched along the walls, moving independently, converging on the corners of every room. Noah screamed as the hallway seemed to lengthen unnaturally, the floorboards stretching like elastic, twisting beneath their feet. When Thomas shone a flashlight toward the doorway, the figure was gone, but the faint smell of decay lingered. By the third night, the stranger's presence escalated. Items moved on their own. chairs scraping floors, doors swinging open, windows closing and locking by themselves. And always, just at the edge of perception, a soft hum, the sound of counting. 1, 2, 3. Rachel discovered a journal tucked behind a loose wallboard in the study. The pages were yellowed, filled with accounts of previous families who had lived in the house. Every entry ended with the same ominous phrase: "The visitor comes at midnight. Count or be claimed." The Millers realized with growing horror that the figure was not random. He had a purpose. He was a harbinger of reckoning, visiting families to measure them, to test them. And once counted, those who failed vanished. The family tried to leave, but the car wouldn't start. The keys slipped from their hands as if the stranger's unseen fingers gripped them. The house itself seemed alive, walls subtly bending, hallways twisting, guiding them toward the living room where shadows gathered, thick and menacing. Noah clutched his mother's hand. "He's going to take us," he whispered. "He's always counting." The Millers knew that survival meant understanding the rules the visitor imposed. They had to endure the night, observe the patterns, and find a way to appease or outsmart the being who existed beyond normal perception. A visitor who thrived on fear and precision. And so, as midnight approached once more, the Millers waited. The stranger would appear again, and this time, they would have to confront him or be claimed forever. Asterisk, the clock ticked closer to midnight. Maple Hollow lay under a thick, unnatural fog that swallowed streetlights and muffled every sound. Inside the Miller house, the shadows were longer, darker, and alive, coiling in corners and crawling along the walls like black smoke. Thomas gripped Rachel and Noah's hands tightly. The journal he had found whispered its warnings in his mind. The visitor comes at midnight. Count or be claimed. Then the air shifted. The temperature dropped sharply, icy fingers curling around their spines. A soft, deliberate tap, tap. Tap began at the front door. The door rattled violently, then swung open on its own. There he was, the visitor. Tall, pale, faceless, his coat flapping though the air was still. Hollow grey eyes pierced the room, and the faint echo of a counting rhythm filled their minds. 1, 2, 3, 4. Thomas tried to block the door, but his arms passed through the figure like smoke. Rachel screamed as the shadows stretched toward Noah, twisting into shapes that mirrored the visitor. Time itself seemed to slow. The floorboards warped, the walls shifted, hallways bending impossibly. Noah's notebook glowed faintly in the dim light. The sketches he had drawn, numbers, symbols, and patterns, now pulsed with a strange energy. Rachel realized the visitor was feeding off the fear, but also bound by rules. If they could complete the count properly, they might survive. Lily's words from another story she had read in town came back. A visitor can be repelled if its measure is returned correctly. Rachel whispered Thomas. Follow the patterns. Noah, help me trace the symbols from the journal. Together, they recreated the sequence. Numbers traced in chalk on the floor. Shapes repeated precisely as the visitor had counted them over the past nights. The shadows recoiled slightly, hissing, the figure swaying as if impatient. The visitor advanced. Each step distorted reality, walls bending, ceilings stretching. Yet the family persisted, chalk tracing completed, numbers confirmed. The count returned to him. Then the figure paused. Its hollow eyes flickered with curiosity. The counting in their minds accelerated. 4, 4, 4. Complete. complete. Complete, with a deafening pulse of orange-white light. The visitor shrieked a sound not human, not natural, and dissolved into the fog, leaving behind only a faint echo. The walls of the house relaxed, returning to normal, the shadows vanishing, the cold lifting. The family collapsed, exhausted, trembling. They had survived, but the house still exuded a subtle, lingering dread. By morning, Maple Hollow looked peaceful again. Fog rolled lazily across streets, sunlight reflected off dew-covered rooftops, and life appeared ordinary. The Millers, however, knew better, even miles away at their new home. Shadows sometimes flickered in mirrors, faint counting whispered in the quiet moments, and Noah's notebook occasionally shifted on its own, pages rearranging into numbers that pulsed softly with the visitor's presence. The visitor had not forgotten them. It had passed, but its measure remained, a shadow over their lives. Maple Hollow would see it again someday. Another family, unprepared, would awaken to the tapping, the counting, and the presence of the midnight guest. And the Millers knew one immutable truth: some visitors are patient, and the count is eternal. Story 3. The music box visitor. Fern Hollow had always seemed like a town out of a storybook. Its cobblestone streets glistened with autumn rain. Gas lamp-style streetlights flickered softly in the fog, and the scent of burning wood floated through the narrow alleys. But beneath the quaint charm, whispers of odd happenings, vanished townsfolk, and strange guests circulated among the elders. Outsiders were rare, and those who lingered too long were never seen again. The Harper family, living in an aging Victorian mansion at the edge of town, had never paid attention to these stories. Richard Harper, a historian, had purchased the mansion for its antique charm. His wife, Margaret, admired its architecture, and their children, Emily, 16, and Daniel, 10, loved exploring its hidden nooks and forgotten corridors. Life was quiet and orderly. It had been until the visitor arrived. It began one rain-soaked evening. Emily had been arranging her collection of vintage books in the parlor when a knock at the door startled her. The figure on the doorstep was impossibly tall, draped in a black overcoat soaked from the rain. His face was pale and expressionless, his grey eyes shimmering faintly as if absorbing the dim lamplight. I have a gift," he said, holding a small, intricately carved music box. "I was told this family appreciates rare music boxes." There was something unnerving about the way he spoke, soft, measured, yet layered with an intangible authority. Emily hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her, and she allowed him inside. The visitor didn't sit, eat, or engage beyond placing the music box on the center table. When he wound it, a delicate, haunting melody filled the room, sweet, almost playful, yet deeply wrong, like a lullaby sung by a presence from another world. Shadows along the walls seemed to ripple, as if the notes themselves had waked at first. The family tried to ignore it. Margaret smiled politely, Richard examined the craftsmanship of the box, and Daniel wandered curiously near it. But soon, things became impossible to dismiss. Candles flickered violently despite no drafts. Shadows stretched unnaturally along walls, and the music seemed to echo faintly in corners where no speaker existed. Then Daniel began to change. While the visitor's music played, he would wander in a trance, whispering the notes softly, tracing patterns in the air. Emily grabbed his hand once, only to feel a cold numbness radiate from his fingertips, as if the melody had latched onto his soul. Richard confronted the visitor. "Who are you?" "Why are you here?" The visitor tilted his head slightly. "I am a guest, invited only by those who do not yet understand the cost of hospitality." His voice was calm, polite, yet every word sent a chill through the room. The nights that followed escalated in horror. The visitor returned precisely at dusk, always leaving at dawn. With each visit, the music grew more sinister notes, warped, melodies twisted into dissonant sequences. Clocks slowed or stopped entirely when it played. Mirrors reflected the family incorrectly. Their movements lagged, their faces pale and hollow, sometimes blurred entirely as if they weren't fully there. Rain fell sideways outside, and shadows detached from walls, twisting into human-like shapes, writhing along the furniture as if alive. Emily, desperate for answers, investigated the house. She discovered a hidden study behind a false bookshelf and found dozens of yellowed journals. Each chronicled a family who had previously lived in the mansion. Every entry told a similar tale: a mysterious visitor, a music box, and a night that stretched endlessly with shadows, counting, and whispers. Some families vanished entirely. Others were never the same, haunted by the melody for the rest of their lives. The journals suggested that the music box itself was alive, a vessel for a supernatural entity bound to record, measure, and consume the attention, fear, and time of those it visited. Families who interacted with it improperly were claimed, their lives feeding its endless song. One night, as the visitor placed the music box on the parlor table, the music began on its own before he had even wound it. The melody was sharper now, twisted, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the very air. Daniel was drawn to it again, moving like a puppet, murmuring strange sequences of numbers, dates, and symbols. Emily clutched his arm, her nails digging into his skin as the shadows stretched toward him, reaching for the family. Margaret screamed when the lights flickered out entirely, and in the darkness, Emily could see the visitor's silhouette against the faint orange glow from the fireplace pail. Faceless, almost too tall, almost too still, yet radiating an oppressive energy. Emily remembered something she had read in one of the journals. The visitor obeyed rules. Its power was formidable, but precise. It was drawn to fear, to attention, and to hesitation, but it could be confronted through understanding its measure. As the music reached a crescendo, Emily realized the visitor was testing them. Each night, each note, each shadow, each number was part of a sequencer, reckoning that must be acknowledged. To survive, they would need to replicate the visitor's measure precisely, using the music, numbers, and patterns from the journals to complete the count before dawn. The family huddled together, trembling as the visitor stood motionless, eyes grey, watching. The music swelled and warped, shadows forming grotesque shapes, the mansion itself seeming to stretch impossibly, corridors bending in ways that defied logic. Emily could feel the weight of centuries of previous victims pressing down, the house vibrating with anticipation, waiting for the reckoning. The visitor spoke softly, almost like a whisper in Emily's mind. The measure must be exact. One wrong step, and it will be yours. As the clock in the hall chimed midnight, the family understood their fate. They had no choice but to confront the music, the shadows, and the visitor's meticulous counting. One misstep, one hesitation, and the mansion itself would claim them. Emily clenched her fists, determination overcoming fear. She turned to Daniel and Margaret. "We have to do this, together. Follow the patterns, complete the count." The visitor nodded slightly, not in approval, but acknowledgement. The game, the trial, the reckoning was about to begin, and outside the mansion, in the fog-filled streets of Fern Hollow, a faint melody echoed softly, as though warning the town that the visitor had chosen again, and the night was only beginning. Midnight arrived with unnatural stillness. The Victorian mansion of the Harpers groaned as if alive, the wooden floor stretching, the chandeliers swaying though there was no wind. Outside, fog clung to the windows, thick and suffocating, and the faint whistle of the visitor's melody seemed to float through the walls. Emily, Margaret and Daniel huddled together in the parlor, the journals and sketches spread before them. The visitor stood near the center of the room, motionless, pale, his grey eyes glowing faintly, reflecting every flicker of candlelight. The music box had begun to play on its own, notes twisting into dissonant chords that rattled the air. Shadows sprouted from the corners, coiling around furniture and creeping along walls like living smoke. Emily could feel them brushing against her skin, cold, almost sentient. The measure. "We must complete it exactly," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Follow the patterns. Trace the numbers." Daniel's small hands shook as he followed her instructions, drawing chalk patterns on the floor, numbers forming glowing sequences. Margaret carefully repeated the intricate symbols from the journals, her voice chanting softly as she traced the shapes in the air. The visitor's eyes seemed to pierce through them, yet he did not move. His presence alone distorted reality. The ceiling seemed to bend. The fireplace warped into a portal of swirling shadows, and the walls breathed with unnatural life. As the last symbol was drawn, the music surged violently. Shadows lunged at the family, merging into grotesque forms, faces twisted in agony, hands reaching, writhing, grasping. The visitor lifted a hand, slow, deliberate. The shadows froze mid-air, as if tethered to him. Emily felt a surge of fear, but then a strange clarity. The visitor's power was precise, bound by rules. If they maintained the sequence without faltering, they could survive. The final note struck. Emily whispered the last sequence aloud, her voice echoing unnaturally, vibrating through the mansion. Daniel and Margaret mirrored her, completing the chant. The visitor tilted his head, grey eyes narrowing in silent calculation. Then, as if acknowledging defeat, he began to dissipate. Shadows recoiled violently, the warped walls snapped back into place, and the music box's melody slowed, then stopped entirely. A sudden gust extinguished the candles, plunging the room into darkness. When Emily relit one, the visitor was gone. The mansion fell silent still, empty, yet forever changed. The family collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Daniel clutched the chalk patterns, as if holding on to his life itself. Margaret whispered, "Is it over?" Emily did not answer immediately. She felt an invisible weight had lifted, yet an echo of the melody lingered, vibrating in her mind. The visitor had been repelled, for now, but she knew the music box still existed, somewhere in the house, waiting. Weeks passed. The Harpers attempted normalcy, but the mansion carried traces of the visitor. Shadows flickered unnaturally, faint notes drifted in empty rooms, and mirrors sometimes reflected figures that weren't there. Daniel refused to touch the music box again, but sometimes it would wind itself, playing a single haunting note before silence returned. Emily began to understand the visitor's true nature. It was not a being in the traditional sense, but a force of measurement, of reckoning, bound to feed on fear, curiosity, and attention. Families could survive if they solved the sequence, but the visitor would always return, patient, eternal, calculating. One rainy evening, as Emily peeked through the fogged windows, she thought she saw a shadow in the distance, tall, pale, coat dripping, standing silently on the cobblestone street. And though it did not move, she could feel its eyes on the mansion, counting, waiting for the next mistake. The Harpers had survived, but only because they understood the rules. The visitor was still out there, patient, ever watchful, and the melody, eternal, and somewhere in Fern Hollow, another family would soon hear the knock, the soft haunting melody and the chilling whisper, "I am your guest, invited only by those who do not yet know the cost of my company." The music played again, faint but unmistakable. Story 4. The Midnight Painter. Ravenwood was a town that most outsiders avoided, tucked between dense forests and fog-laden hills. Its streets were narrow, lined with weathered brick buildings, and its residents were tight-lipped, guarding secrets older than the town itself. The Lawson family had recently moved into an old two-story cottage on Elm Street. It had been abandoned for years, left to weather the creeping ivy and moss. Julia Lawson, a single mother, had taken the house on a bargain, believing that a fresh start in Ravenwood would be good for her children. Max and Lily. The first sign that something was wrong came a week after moving in. Julia was unpacking boxes in the attic when she noticed a figure at the window of the old barn across the street. A mantle, slender, with a pale face, stood perfectly still, staring directly at her. He held something in his hands, a canvas and a wooden box of paints. Before Julia could react, he disappeared into the fog. That night, strange things began. The sound of faint scratching, as if brushes were moving across a canvas, echoed through the house. Max insisted he saw shadows moving across the walls, forming shapes that resembled people but twisted, distorted, and impossible. Lily claimed she could hear whispering voices telling her to look closer. The next evening, the man returned, standing silently by the edge of the forest, canvas underarm. Julia stepped outside, heart racing. "Who are you?" she demanded. He did not speak. Instead, he placed the canvas on an easel in the middle of the street and began painting in complete silence. The images on the canvas were unnerving, scenes of the Lawson house, but with subtle differences. Windows where none existed, doors slightly ajar, shadows forming figures that didn't belong. It was as if he was painting their home and their lives from another dimension. Each night, he returned. Each painting grew darker, more detailed, more alive. Sometimes, Julia swore the figures in the paintings moved when no one was watching. Max refused to sleep alone, claiming he could see the man's eyes in the corners of rooms. Lily grew pale, whispering that the painter was looking at her soul. Desperate, Julia confronted him one evening as he set up his canvas near the old oak at the edge of their property. "Why are you doing this? What do you want?" The man finally spoke, his voice soft but chilling, like wind over dead leaves. "I capture what is hidden, what is waiting to be revealed. You cannot leave once the brush touches the air of this place." Fear gripped Julia, but she was determined to protect her children. She tried to leave Ravenwood, but no matter which road she took, the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. Days passed, but the town remained impossible to escape. Then the true horror began. One morning, Julia found a painting in her living room, unsigned, and wet with fresh paint. It depicted the Lawson family asleep in their beds, but their faces were pale and distorted, their eyes hollow. The brushstrokes shimmered as if the figures could move at any moment. Julia realized the painter wasn't just painting. He was predicting, shaping, and possibly controlling the fate of those he painted. Each night he returned, each stroke of his brush brought their reality closer to the painted images. As midnight approached, a sense of dread filled the house. The whispering grew louder, the shadows stretched along the walls, and the wind outside carried the faint smell of paint and decay. The painter's next canvas appeared on the porch, larger than before, showing not just the house, but the family trapped inside, screaming silently, shadows consuming them. Julia clutched her children, her mind racing. If the painter's art dictated reality, then every stroke could mean a step closer to their doom. She had to find a way to stop him. But how do you confront something that exists between brushstrokes, shadows, and reality itself? The fog rolled in thicker than ever that night, swallowing the roads and muting the sounds of the town. From the corner of her eye, Julia could see the painter, standing silently under the oak, brush poised, waiting for her to falter, for the family to become part of his ever-growing gallery of horror. The fog lay thick over Ravenwood, swallowing every street, every lamppost, every sound. Inside the Lawson house, Julia clutched Max and Lily to her chest. The painter's presence was no longer distant. The air itself seemed to hum with the weight of his gaze. Shadows crept along the walls, stretching unnaturally, whispering the faintest hints of the painter's haunting melody. On the porch, under the twisted oak tree, the painter set up his easel. The canvas glowed faintly, though no light touched it. Each brushstroke he made seemed to bend reality. A slight flick of the wrist and the floorboards groaned. The walls shimmered, and a shadow twisted into the shape of Max. Screaming silently from inside the painting dot, Julia realized with horror, the painter didn't just capture them, he could rewrite reality with his art. Every stroke threatened to replace their living selves with painted versions. Trapped forever in his gallery of nightmares, with trembling hands, Julia grabbed a palette from the porch and faced him. "I won't let you take my family," she shouted, though her voice trembled with fear. The painter paused. For the first time, he acknowledged her. "Then paint, or be painted." The words chilled her to the bone. She looked down at the empty canvas beside her, then at the fresh palette. Julia understood. This was not just about running or hiding. She had to fight him with the same medium that gave him power, paint and creation, not fear. Night stretched endlessly as Julia, Max, and Lily began to paint. Following the strange instructions she remembered from the journals she had found earlier, each stroke needed to mirror the painter's style yet deviate, just enough to trap him within the image instead of their reality. The mansion reacted violently. Walls rippled like liquid, mirrors cracked, chandeliers swung, and the air hummed with supernatural energy. Shadows lunged at them, forming grotesque figures. Yet every stroke Julia completed seemed to push them back, confining them to the canvas. Max, trembling, painted the twisted oak outside, capturing the painter's silhouette in every shadow. Lily, small and pale, painted a protective frame around the family, glowing faintly with light that seemed to solidify reality. Finally, Julia painted the last stroke, a swirling vortex on the canvas designed to pull the painter inside. The painter raised his brush one final time, but the vortex glimmered brighter than his shadow, stronger than his presence. A chilling scream, silent yet deafening, ripped through the fog as the painter's figure began to unravel, melting into paint, shadows, and mist. Then silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. The mansion settled back into its natural form. Candles flickered weakly. The shadows retreated to corners. The air no longer hummed with menace. The family collapsed together, gasping, trembling, alive. But Julia knew this was not truly over. The painter's power was immense, bound to his art, and his presence lingered in every canvas he had touched, waiting for the next family, foolish enough to look, curious enough to be caught. Days later, when the fog lifted, Julia packed what little she could and left Ravenwood with Max and Lily. She had survived, but the echo of the painter's brush haunted her mind. In every painting she passed, every shadow she glimpsed, she could almost see him, waiting patiently for the day he would rise again. And back in the house on Elm Street, the easel remained, blank but still, a faint smear of paint glowing in the moonlight, as if whispering, "I am always here, waiting for the next brushstroke, the next soul to capture." Even as they drove away, Julia felt it, a subtle pull, like invisible fingers dragging her gaze back, toward Ravenwood, toward the house, toward the unseen artist who would never truly leave. The Midnight Painters Gallery was eternal, and somewhere the next canvas awaited. Story 5. The clockmaker's visitor, the town of Greywood, had a peculiar charm. Its cobblestone streets were lined with old-fashioned shops, and a single clock tower dominated the skyline, its chimes echoing through the town square. But Greywood was also a place of whispered warnings. The townsfolk spoke of visitors who came unexpectedly and never left strangers, whose presence warped time itself. The Winslow family lived in a restored 19th century townhouse near the square. Jonathan Winslow, a watchmaker, ran a small clock shop, while his wife, Clara, taught at the local school. Their teenage daughter, Sophie, loved the intricate workings of clocks, and their young son Leo had a fascination with gears and cogs. Life was peaceful until the visitor arrived. It was just past midnight when a faint knock echoed through the Winslow home. Clara opened the door to find a man standing in the doorway, dressed in an old-fashioned suit and bowler hat. He carried an antique wooden box, polished to a dark sheen. His pale face and piercing amber eyes gave him an otherworldly air. "I come with a gift," he said in a soft, deliberate tone. "A gift for those who respect time." He did not wait for an invitation. Without another word, he placed the box on Jonathan's workbench and began to wind the clocks in the house manually. Each tick seemed unnaturally loud. The pendulums swung faster than physics allowed. That night, Jonathan noticed the first anomaly. Time moved differently. Hours felt like minutes, and minutes dragged into eternity. Clocks spun wildly, their hands skipping forward and backward. Shadows stretched across walls, twisting into shapes that resembled people. Silent, distorted figures frozen in motion. The next evening, the visitor returned. He brought a new clock every night, each one more intricate and bizarre. Some had faces that reflected things that weren't there, past events, possible futures, twisted versions of the Winslows themselves. Sophie first noticed the pattern. "Mum, Dad, these clocks, they're showing us." She pointed to a grandfather clock whose hands moved independently of the others. Its glass reflected their home, but the figures in it were older, tired, and not entirely human. Leo, fascinated, reached out to touch the clocks. but the visitor's gaze stopped him. "Not yet," he said softly. "Time is measured here, and every moment counts." As the nights passed, the Winslows began to feel the psychological toll. They could not leave the house. Streets outside seemed to shift subtly, turning familiar paths into loops, leading them back to the townhouse. Sleep became impossible. Dreams were invaded by visions of the visitor winding massive, invisible clocks, his amber eyes glinting as he measured their lives. One night, the visitor left a note. "Those who do not respect the measure of time will be taken by it. Complete the cycles, or remain in my gallery forever." Clara, terrified, scoured the house and discovered hidden compartments in the walls. Inside were dozens of journals and schematics, records of families who had encountered the visitor before. Every entry detailed the same pattern: a mysterious visitor, clocks that defied natural laws, and time that twisted into a living trap. Some families had vanished entirely. Others had emerged, changed, haunted by visions of clocks and endless moments. Jonathan, desperate, realized the visitor's true power. He could manipulate reality through time itself, using the clocks to bend events, warp perception, and trap those who failed to respect the measure. Every clock was a potential prison, every tick a threat. The family's situation grew more perilous when the visitor left the largest clock yet, an enormous, intricate tower clock that seemed impossibly heavy, yet appeared in their living room, its pendulum swinging with a life of its own. Its chimes resonated unnaturally, echoing in their minds, slowing and accelerating time with every toll as midnight approached. The Winslows realized they had to confront the visitor directly. Each tick of the clocks was now a countdown. The amber-eyed man appeared in the parlor, silently measuring them with a cold, methodical stare. He wound the massive tower clock, and the air around them thickened, shimmering with a strange golden haze. Reality seemed to ripple like water. Jonathan, Clara, Sophie, and Leo huddled together, knowing that a single misstep could trap them in a timeless prison, existing only as distorted reflections in the visitor's infinite network of clocks. The visitor raised his hand, motionless but commanding, as the chimes struck 12, and the house itself seemed to hold its breath. The chimes of the enormous tower clock echoed through the Winslow townhouse, each strike reverberating like a hammer against reality itself. Time was no longer linear. Minutes stretched into hours, seconds flickered like candlelight, and the walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the clock's heartbeat. Jonathan, Clara, Sophie, and Leo huddled together in the parlor. The visitor stood motionless near the tower clock, his amber eyes glowing like molten gold, measuring them with a precision that chilled every bone in their bodies. "You've understood the measure, but do you respect it?" the visitor asked, his voice calm, echoing unnaturally through the warped air. "One wrong tick, one misstep, and time will claim you." Jonathan realized the only way to survive was to manipulate the clocks themselves, to force the visitor into his own device. He quickly examined the tower clock's inner gear's massive cogs that glowed faintly, as though powered by some otherworldly force. "Follow me," he whispered to his family. "We have to reverse the cycles, break the rhythm." Clara and Sophie assisted him, Leo clutching a smaller grandfather clock as a stabilizing anchor. Together, they began to move the gears in a synchronized pattern, attempting to disrupt the visitor's control over time. The visitor reacted instantly. Shadows stretched from the walls, coiling around them like living chains. The pendulum swung violently, faster and slower by turns, and the house itself seemed to breathe, walls bending, floors warping. Each family member felt the pressure of time crushing down, a weight so intense it threatened to shatter their minds. Sophie, trembling, reached for the visitor's paintbox-like toolkit he had brought. Inside, she found a strange golden key that seemed to pulse in response to the clock's chimes. With a desperate intuition, she inserted it into the tower clock's core, and the gears began to align with their combined effort. The visitor screamed in impossible sound that seemed to exist both within and outside of time, as the clockwork he had controlled began to turn against him. Shadows twisted violently, and the golden haze around the house surged, cracking mirrors and distorting reflections. Jonathan made the final adjustment. With a forceful push, the tower clock's pendulum reversed its swing, spinning backward at impossible speed. The visitor's form began to flicker, unstable, caught between the real world and the endless temporal loops he had created. "Time is mine," he bellowed, but each word warped unnaturally, echoing infinitely, dissolving into static with a final, thunderous chime. The visitor was pulled into the heart of the tower clock, his body unraveling into shadows, mist, and golden sparks of light. The clocks all over the house stilled, their hands frozen, their ticking silent. The oppressive pressure lifted. The Winslows collapsed, trembling, gasping for air, but alive. The house returned to normal, yet something lingered, faint. Golden light shimmered within the gears of the tower clock, a reminder that the visitor had not been destroyed, merely trapped. He was contained, but patient, eternal, waiting for the next family who might falter before time itself. Days later, the Winslows left Greywood, carrying only memories and the knowledge that time was no longer a constantite, was a living force. And some visitors wielded it with terrifying precision. Yet Jonathan couldn't help but glance back at the tower clock in the distance, its hands still frozen at midnight. A subtle shimmer traced the edge of the pendulum, and he felt deep in his soul that the amber eyes of the clockmaker visitor were still watching, still measuring, still counting, waiting for the next mistake. And somewhere in Greywood, the wind carried a faint tick-tock, soft but insistent, as if time itself whispered, "I am eternal, and I never forget."
Story 6, The Lantern Stranger. The small town of Willow Creek was known for its quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and the thick mist that rolled off the river every evening. Locals warned newcomers never to walk alone after sunset, but the warnings were mostly dismissed as superstition. The Harper family had recently moved into a quaint riverside cottage. Daniel Harper, a history teacher, and his wife, Rachel, along with their teenage daughter, Emma, were looking forward to a peaceful life away from the city. The cottage, with its creaky floors and ivy-covered walls, seemed perfect, except for the rumors whispered by the town's elders. It all began on a cold autumn night. Emma was reading by the fireplace when she noticed a faint glow outside the window. At first, she thought it was a lantern carried by a fisherman on the river. But the light moved unnaturally, gliding over the water and along the riverbank without disturbing the reeds. Curious, Emma stepped outside. The lantern's glow hovered a few feet above the ground, drifting slowly toward the woods. A figure emerged from the mist, tall, cloaked, with a featureless pale face, carrying the glowing lantern. Its presence seemed to distort the air, making the fog swirl like it had a mind of its own. Emma froze, unsure whether to call for her parents. The figure stopped at the edge of the trees, tilting its head as if observing her. Then, without warning, it vanished, leaving only the lantern floating for a moment before it too disappeared. Over the next few nights, the figure returned. Always silent. Always gliding with the lantern, always appearing near the river at the same hour. The family's dogs would bark uncontrollably, but when anyone tried to approach, the figure melted into the mist before they could reach it. Soon, strange phenomena began to plague the Harper home. Doors left open would slam shut on their own. Shadows moved independently, stretching across walls in impossible ways. Objects were misplaced, often appearing near the window overlooking the river, no matter where they had been left. Daniel, a skeptic by nature, tried to rationalize the events. But one evening, the family found a circle of wet footprints forming around their kitchen table. They led directly to the window facing the river, ending at a single glowing spot on the floor where the lantern had once hovered. Emma swore the footprints seemed to pulse, as if alive. Rachel noticed another unsettling detail: the lantern's light, whenever it appeared, cast long shadows that did not match reality. Sometimes the shadows seemed to show figures standing behind the family, figures that did not exist in the room. Then came the warning. One night, as the Harper family huddled in the living room, the lantern drifted into view, floating just outside the window. The figure held it high, illuminating a message scrawled in the fog on the glass. "You are being watched. Time is thin. Do not stray from the path, or you will follow me forever." Fear gripped the family. They were being stalked by a supernatural entity, one that seemed tied to the river, the fog, and the lantern's ghostly glow. Each night the visits grew longer, the lantern brighter, the shadows more twisted. Daniel decided to confront it. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of defiance, he stepped outside at dusk, calling into the mist. The lantern floated closer, revealing the pale, featureless face of the figure. It tilted its head slowly, and for a terrifying moment, Daniel felt his own body stiffen, as if the lantern's glow was freezing him in place. Emma screamed from the doorway, snapping him out of the trance. The figure vanished into the mist, leaving only the lantern on the riverbank, glowing faintly. Daniel rushed back inside, and the family barricaded themselves for the night. By morning, the fog had lifted, and the lantern was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The Harpers realized this visitor was not human, not bound by the rules of the living, and not deterred by fear or confrontation. They could see it in their dreams now, the lantern drifting silently, the figure gliding just beyond sight, always observing, always waiting. And Emma whispered one morning, with trembling lips. "It doesn't just watch, it learns. And it's learning us." Night fell over Willow Creek like a velvet curtain, thick fog rolling from the river to shroud the Harper cottage. The lantern appeared again, glowing unnaturally bright, its light cutting through the mist like a knife. The featureless figure floated silently above the riverbank, watching, waiting. Daniel, Rachel, Emma, and Leo knew they could no longer ignore it. They had tried fleeing, barricading, even confronting it, but the lantern stranger was more than a ghost. It was a predator tied to the river, feeding on attention, curiosity, and fear. And it had chosen them. The figure glided closer, its pale face still featureless, its lantern swinging as if marking a heartbeat. Shadows from the lantern stretched unnaturally into the cottage, wrapping around the walls, twisting into figures of people the family knew, and didn't. Whispers drifted on the wind, faint but intelligible. "Follow, or remain, forever." Emma grabbed her father's hand. "It wants us to leave the house, but where?" she whispered. She realized the lantern didn't just mark presence, it marked a path, a narrow, winding route through the fog, ending at the river's edge. And the figure followed their every step. The family stepped cautiously onto the misty path. Every step they took, the lantern floated ahead, illuminating obstacles that weren't there moments before, roots rising from the ground like hands, shadows forming walls that shifted as they passed, branches curling toward them like skeletal fingers. Rachel's heart pounded as she realized the lantern's glow was warping their perception of reality. The fog was alive, shaping itself around the family, creating illusions of false paths, looping them back toward danger. One wrong step, and they would be trapped forever. At the riverbank, the lantern hovered just above the water, reflecting a distorted version of the family in the ripples, older, hollow-eyed, terrified, frozen in motion. Daniel understood with horror, the lantern stranger didn't just stalk the living, it captured their souls in reflections and shadows. Desperation struck. Daniel grabbed a length of rope and a rowboat moored nearby. The plan was simple but terrifying. They had to use the river itself to sever the entity's tether, to force it into a space it could not dominate. As they paddled, the lantern floated above the water, closer and closer. The figure tilted its head, and the fog thickened, forming monstrous shapes that lunged at the boat. Emma screamed, and Leo clutched her arm as spectral hands reached for them, dissolving into mist before they could touch. Daniel rowed harder, following a spot in the water where the lantern's reflection shimmered. Rachel tossed a mirror from the boat into the river, the figure recoiled violently. Golden light flared, shadows shrieking as if in pain. The river itself seemed to respond, rippling in unnatural currents that pulled the lantern toward its reflection in the water. Emma and Leo, trembling, held the rope taut, anchoring it to a tree on the riverbank. The lantern floated directly above the mirror now, its glow merging with its reflection. The figure tilted back, silent but screaming in a way the mind could not comprehend. With a final, desperate push, Daniel knocked the lantern into the river. The mirror caught it perfectly, and in a blinding flash of golden light, the lantern stranger was pulled into its own reflection, trapped in the mirror beneath the water. The fog lifted immediately, and the river returned to calm, natural ripples. The family collapsed in the boat, gasping, shaking, alive. The haunting whispers ceased. The shadows no longer twisted, and the figure was gone, trapped but not destroyed. Somewhere beneath the river, the lantern stranger waited, patient and eternal, bound to the mirror world but always observing. Days later, the Harpers left Willow Creek, carrying only the memory of endless nights, drifting lanterns, and distorted reflections. Emma still felt eyes on her in mirrors, Rachel heard whispers in windless rooms, and Daniel never forgot the sense of time stretching, bending, and watching, a reminder that some visitors could never truly be destroyed. And on foggy nights by the river, if one looked closely, a faint glow could be seen beneath the water, a lantern, drifting silently, as if waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close. "I wait," the wind seemed to whisper, "for those who wander where they should not, for those who see too much." The Harper family had survived, but the lantern stranger's presence lingered, a perpetual, unseen terror, ready to claim the unwary once more. Story 7, The Whispering Postman. The town of Maple Hollow was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least, they thought they did. Streets were lined with maple trees whose leaves turned gold and crimson in autumn, and the town square was dominated by a modest post office, where residents collected their letters and parcels daily. It was quaint, cozy, and ordinary, until the stranger arrived. The Coleman family lived on the outskirts, in a brick house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Mark Coleman, a local mechanic, worked long hours at the garage, while his wife, Diane, managed a small bakery from their home. Their children, 13-year-old Lucas and 8-year-old Mia, were typical kids, curious, imaginative, and sometimes mischievous. It started subtly. Letters began arriving that nobody remembered ordering. Postmarked Maple Hollow, yet the handwriting was unfamiliar, precise, almost mechanical, with looping flourishes that seemed wrong. The envelopes were always addressed correctly, but each letter contained a single line. "I am watching. I know your secrets." At first, the family laughed it off. Perhaps a prank, or a quirky new resident with a strange sense of humor. But then the letters became more personal, referencing private events, arguments no one else should have known about, hidden fears, even childhood memories. One rainy evening, a new visitor appeared at their door. Drenched, carrying a satchel, he wore a gray uniform with a faded postal insignia, and his face was partially hidden under the brim of a hat. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes reflected a strange glint, like light bouncing off metal. "I've come with your delivery," he said, voice soft yet echoing unnaturally, like a whisper carried on wind. "Special letters, for your family. Diane, uneasy, took the letters. The visitor gave no name, no address, and turned to leave, but before disappearing down the wet, leaf-strewn path, he paused and tilted his head. Unnaturally, watching them. The sensation was chilling, as if he could see not just the house but into the house, into their minds. Over the following nights, the Coleman family noticed subtle intrusions. Footsteps in hallways when no one was there. Murmured whispers in empty rooms. Lights flickering in patterns that mimicked speech. And always, the letters continued to arrive, one per night, each more invasive, detailing not only private fears but predicting future actions. Lucas tried to confront the visitor, leaving a note at the door, "Who are you?" But in the morning, he found the note neatly folded, placed atop the stack of letters, with a single new sentence written inside. Curiosity is dangerous. Mia, the youngest, began to talk about a man she saw in the shadows, standing silently by her bed, whispering words she could not understand, but words that made her tremble and hide under her blanket. One night, Mark stayed up late in the living room, determined to catch the visitor. Around midnight, a figure materialized on the porch, the postman, glowing faintly in the moonlight, his satchel emitting an unnatural hum. Mark lunged forward, but the figure vanished before he could reach him, leaving behind only a letter glowing faintly with golden ink. Diane read it aloud. "Every secret has a price. Every truth a toll. You cannot hide, you cannot escape. I am here." Fear became suffocating. Even when the family tried to leave the house, the town seemed different. Streets twisted, houses shifted, familiar paths looping back to their home. It was as if the visitor controlled the very geometry of Maple Hollow, bending reality to his will. Then came the final warning in Part 1, a letter without envelope, delivered by no one. The words were etched into the parchment as if burned. "Tonight, I collect." The Coleman family realized that the postman was not a man, not human, but a supernatural entity that preyed on secrets, curiosity, and fear. Their home, and even the town, was now a trap. And midnight was approaching. Midnight fell like a shroud over Maple Hollow, the streets slick with rain and mist curling unnaturally along the sidewalks. The Coleman house seemed alive, each creaking floorboard and flickering light amplifying the terror inside. The whispering postman had returned, but this time, he was not alone. The shadows in the house writhed and moved in patterns that mimicked the family's every fear. Mark, Diane, Lucas, and Mia huddled in the living room, clutching each other as the golden glow of the letters illuminated the walls. The air was thick, almost tangible, pulsing with a low hum that seemed to come from the letters themselves. Suddenly, the front door creaked open on its own. Rain poured in, drenching the floor, and there he was, the postman, pale and featureless, his uniform warped and impossibly long, the satchel glowing as if alive. His voice was a whisper, yet it echoed through the room, touching every corner. Every secret, every fear. I collect tonight. Diane realized the only way to survive was to confront the letters themselves. Each letter acted as a tether, anchoring the postman to their home and feeding his power. She grabbed the stack of letters and began burning them in the fireplace, one by one. As the first letter ignited, the postman shrieked, not a human scream, but a sound of shifting reality, like glass shattering in multiple dimensions. Shadows detached from the walls, swirling violently around the family, and whispers escalated into a cacophony of voices, each repeating their secrets, their fears, their sins. Lucas tried to help, tossing letters into the flames, but each new letter that burned released a burst of golden smoke, forming twisted reflections of the family, trapped in their own fears. Mia screamed as she saw a shadowy version of herself reaching out from the smoke, crying silently. Mark realized they needed to draw the postman into the fire's reflection, using the mirror above the fireplace as a portal. He positioned a large, ornate mirror near the hearth, and Diane and Lucas carefully held the burning letters above it. The postman advanced, floating above the floor, his form distorting like liquid wax. As he reached the mirror, the golden smoke from the letters formed a funnel, pulling him into his own reflection. He screamed, a sound that seemed to stretch across time itself, before vanishing entirely into the mirrored surface. The shadows collapsed, the whispers ceased, and the house fell silent. The letters lay charred, but a faint golden shimmer lingered in the ashes, a warning that the entity was trapped, but not destroyed. Exhausted and trembling, the Coleman family gathered by the window, staring at the mirror. For a moment it was still, reflecting only their pale, shaken faces. Then, in the corner of the glass, a faint silhouette appeared, just a hint of the postman's featureless face, tilting as if observing them, waiting. The next morning, the fog over Maple Hollow had lifted, and life seemed to return to normal. The family decided to leave the town immediately, taking only memories and the terrifying knowledge that some visitors could manipulate reality, secrets, and fear itself. Even after they left, Mia occasionally whispered to Lucas. "He's still watching, through reflections, through letters, he never stops." And on quiet nights in distant towns, when a letter appears with no sender, people feel a soft, whispering presence, a chilling reminder that the whispering postman is patient, eternal, and always seeking the next secret to collect. Story 8, The Midnight Sculptor. The town of Bramblewood was small, isolated, and surrounded by dense forests that locals claimed hid secrets older than the town itself. Most residents had lived there all their lives, but newcomers were rare, and anyone who arrived unannounced often drew wary glances. The Dawson family had recently moved into a Victorian-style home near the edge of town. Jonathan Dawson, an architect, and his wife, Sarah, wanted a fresh start with their two children, Lily, 12, and Max, 9. Their new home had charm, arched windows, a wide porch, and a large attic, but something about the place felt off. The first sign came the night after they moved in. Lily was exploring the attic when she noticed a faint tapping, like a chisel striking stone. She called down to her mother, but Sarah heard nothing. Dismissing it as settling noises, they carried on, but the sound persisted nightly. Then, small statues began appearing around the house. At first, they were subtle, tiny clay figurines on window sills or the mantel, depicting people frozen mid-motion. But as days passed, the statues became more detailed, lifelike, and increasingly unsettling, distorted faces, contorted limbs, eyes that seemed too real. Jonathan tried to rationalize it. Perhaps some previous owner had been an artist, leaving unfinished works. But no records existed of any sculptor ever living there, and the statues had been impossible to miss, they hadn't been there the day before. One stormy night, the family was woken by a low, rasping voice emanating from the attic. "Observe, perfect, immortal." Max peeked toward the attic stairs and saw a hooded figure, working furiously, chiseling a block of stone. The figure's movements were fluid, almost mechanical, but its face remained hidden under the hood. A faint golden glow emanated from the stone itself, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The family was frozen in terror. The figure did not speak again but continued its work, moving with a speed that was unnatural, crafting figures that looked exactly like them. Lily's scream echoed through the house as she recognized her own face emerging from the stone, perfectly captured mid-expression. Attempts to confront the figure proved futile. When Jonathan stormed up the attic stairs, it vanished, leaving behind only the stone statues, cold and lifelike. Even stranger, the statues seemed to move slightly when unobserved, shifting positions ever so subtly, as if breathing. The Dawson family soon realized the visitor appeared only at night and only in shadows. During the day, the statues remained still, but at night, the scratching of chisel against stone filled the air, and the golden glow returned. Windows fogged with condensation, forming shapes, hands, faces, figures, that whispered unintelligible words. Sarah began noticing subtle differences in the statues, expressions too lifelike, gestures capturing her family's most private emotions, fear, anger, grief, etched permanently into stone. It was as if the midnight sculptor knew their deepest thoughts, immortalizing them in clay and marble. One night, Lily stayed awake, hiding behind a door. She watched as the figure returned, carrying a new block of stone. The hood fell back slightly, revealing not a face but a blank, polished surface that reflected the room in terrifying clarity. "Your time is next," the figure whispered, its voice like grinding stone. The Dawson family realized that ignoring it would not save them. The Midnight Sculptor's obsession was not casual, it was fixated on capturing the living, turning life itself into eternal statues. Their home had become a gallery of horrors, and each night, the visitor grew bolder, leaving statues closer and closer to the family bedrooms. The final warning in part 1 came when Max discovered a tiny stone figure in his bed, a miniature version of himself, eyes wide in frozen terror. The Midnight Sculptor had entered their personal spaces, bringing its art dangerously close to completion. The Dawsons understood one horrifying truth: their visitor was not human, not bound by time, and not deterred by fear or confrontation. The statues were a message, a countdown, and the Midnight Sculptor would not rest until the family itself was immortalized in stone. The storm outside raged as the Dawson family huddled in the living room, each shadow stretching unnaturally across the walls. The statues from the attic now populated every corner of the house, their lifelike eyes gleaming in the flickering candlelight. Some stood frozen mid-motion, others crouched as if ready to spring, but all seemed to be watching, waiting. At midnight, the attic door creaked open. A low, rasping sound, like stone scraping against stone, filled the air. The Midnight Sculptor appeared at the top of the stairs, hood pulled low. Its body radiated a faint golden glow, and the chisel in its hand sparkled with unnatural light. "Tonight, you join the gallery," it whispered, voice grinding like marble. Jonathan grabbed a heavy poker from the fireplace, determined to confront the creature, but it did not move like a normal being. It floated down the stairs, each step silent, yet its presence warped the air. The shadows in the room twisted and lengthened, forming distorted shapes of the Dawson family, echoes of themselves, frozen in stone-like terror. Sarah screamed as she noticed that the statues closest to them were subtly moving, their expressions mimicking every flicker of emotion, every gasp, every trembling fear the family displayed. It was no longer an illusion, they were learning from the living, preparing to replicate them perfectly. Max, clutching Lily's hand, noticed a small crack in one of the statues near the fireplace. Gathering courage, he whispered a desperate idea to his mother: if the statues were extensions of the sculptor, destroying them might weaken it. The family began smashing statues one by one. Golden dust and smoke erupted from each broken figure, forming swirling, ghostly shapes that shrieked and recoiled. The sculptor hissed, its form quivering, glowing brighter, the air vibrating with tension. Jonathan realized the final step: the creature had to be lured into the hearth's reflection, like a mirror to trap it. They positioned a large mirror near the fireplace and used the golden smoke from the shattered statues to guide the sculptor toward it. The sculptor advanced, chisel raised, shadows writhing violently along the walls. As it reached the mirror, the smoke funneled it in, and for a moment, the house seemed to hold its breath. The sculptor's hood fell back, revealing a polished, featureless face that reflected the room in terrifying clarity. With a final, deafening scrape of chisel against stone, the sculptor was pulled into the mirror, trapped by the combination of reflection and golden smoke from the destroyed statues. The air stilled, shadows collapsed, and the golden glow faded, leaving only broken statues and the trembling Dawson family. Exhausted, they collapsed to the floor, gasping. The house was silent, but the mirror still shimmered faintly. For a brief moment, the reflection of the hooded figure appeared in the corner, tilting its head as if watching and waiting. The next morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the broken statues lay scattered, inert. The Dawson family left Bramblewood immediately, taking only the knowledge that some visitors are eternal, patient, and obsessed with capturing life itself. Years later, in distant towns, small statues sometimes appeared on doorsteps, meticulously crafted, golden dust faintly clinging to their surfaces. Locals would whisper about a hooded sculptor wandering in the night, and children would wake to find their toys moved, their reflections slightly off, an eternal reminder that the Midnight Sculptor never truly rests. And sometimes, in the quietest hours, If one looked closely in a mirror, a featureless face would stare back, chisel in hand, waiting for the next gallery of life to create.
Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. Terror Mouth.